I never believed in curses, not until I came across that mirror. It all started on a rainy Saturday afternoon when I stumbled upon an old antique shop tucked away in a narrow alley. The shop was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and dust. Shelves lined with peculiar artifacts and odd trinkets filled the small space. My eyes were drawn to an ornate full-length mirror standing in a corner. Its intricate frame was gilded with delicate patterns of vines and flowers, and the glass seemed to shimmer unnaturally. The shopkeeper, a hunched old man with a gravelly voice, noticed my interest. "Ah, the Mirror of Enigma," he said, shuffling over. "It's said to have mysterious history. Some claim it's cursed." I laughed off the notion, intrigued by the mirror's beauty rather than its supposed dark past. Despite the shopkeeper's warnings, I purchased it and took it home, excited to add a touch of elegance to my living room. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was out of place in my home. It stood majestically against the wall, its surface gleaming even in the dim light. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would dispel my unease. Around midnight, I was awoken by a soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I lay still, I realized the sound was coming from the mirror. I got up and approached it cautiously. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, forming words I couldn't quite understand. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, but the whispering continued. I stared into the mirror, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadowy figure behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Over the next few days, the whispers became more frequent, more urgent. They invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares. I began to see fleeting images in the mirror, faces distorted in agony, eyes filled with terror. Each time I looked away and back again, the images were gone, leaving me questioning my sanity. One evening, while reading in the living room, I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The mirror's surface fogged up, and as I watched in horror, words began to appear on the glass, written by an unseen hand. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I reached out to touch the words, but they vanished, leaving only my terrified reflection. Desperate for answers, I returned to the antique shop, but it was closed, and the shopkeeper nowhere to be found. I had no choice but to confront whatever was haunting the mirror on my own. I spent hours researching the mirror's history, combing through old records and dusty books. I discovered that it once belonged to a wealthy family in the 19th century. The daughter, Isabella, was known for her beauty and grace. However, she mysteriously vanished one night, and her disappearance was never solved. Some believe she was trapped inside the mirror by a vengeful spirit. Determined to free Isabella, I decided to perform a seance. I gathered candles, sage, and an old spell book I found in the library. As I chanted the incantations, the room grew colder and the candles flickered violently. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Isabella's ghostly form appeared. "Help me," she pleaded, her voice a faint echo. "Release me from this prison." With trembling hands, I continued the ritual, hoping to break the curse. Suddenly, a dark, malevolent presence filled the room. It was the vengeful spirit, furious at my attempt to free Isabella. The spirit's rage manifested in a violent storm inside my home. Objects flew off shelves and the walls shook. I could feel its icy grip around my throat, suffocating me. Isabella's image began to fade, and I knew I had to act quickly. I recited the final incantation, pouring all my willpower into the words. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, and the spirit's hold on me loosened. A blinding light filled the room, and when it subsided, Isabella stood before me, free at last. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading away, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my living room. The whispers were gone, and the house was silent once more. In the days that followed, I repaired the damage to my home, but the memory of that night lingered. I often wondered what became of Isabella's spirit and whether she found peace. The broken shards of the mirror remained, a constant reminder of the ordeal I endured. I never told anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? But every time I pass by a mirror, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine, fearing that some other spirit might be watching, waiting for a chance to escape. After losing my job in the city, I decided to start fresh in a small rural town. I found a quaint cottage on the edge of Whispering Woods, a forest known for its eerie legends. The locals warned me to stay away from the woods at night, but I dismissed their stories as mere superstition. The cottage was charming, with ivy-covered walls and a cozy fireplace. I felt at peace for the first time in years. The woods were beautiful during the day, with sunlight filtering through the leaves and birds singing. I often took long walks, enjoying the tranquility. One evening, as the sun set, I ventured deeper into the woods than usual. The trees grew denser, and the air became colder. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread, but curiosity pushed me forward. I stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin, its roof caved in and walls covered in moss. As I approached, I heard whispers carried on the wind. They were faint, almost indistinguishable, but they filled me with unease. I peered through a broken window and saw strange symbols etched into the walls. An overwhelming urge to leave gripped me, and I hurried back to the cottage. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder and more insistent. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but their tone was menacing. I felt eyes watching me from the darkness, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The next day I decided to explore the cabin again, hoping to uncover its secrets. I brought a flashlight and a notebook to document anything unusual. As I entered the cabin, the air grew colder and the whispers intensified. I examined the symbols, sketching them in my notebook. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door shut, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me as the whispers turned into frantic screams. I fumbled with the flashlight, illuminating a figure in the corner. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. She stared at me, her lips moving silently. I backed away, but the woman followed, her ghostly form gliding across the floor. She reached out to me, and her touch was like ice. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams. Terrified, I fled the cabin and ran back to the cottage, slamming the door behind me. The whispers continued, growing louder and more desperate. I realized the woman was trying to communicate, but I didn't know how to help her. Over the next few days, the whispers became unbearable. They invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares. I saw the woman's face everywhere, her eyes pleading for help. Desperate, I reached out to the locals, hoping to find someone who knew the cabin's history. An elderly woman named Mrs. Harlow finally provided some answers. She told me about the cabin's tragic past. It belonged to a family who mysteriously disappeared over a century ago. The daughter, Eliza, was rumored to be a witch who summoned dark forces. The townspeople believed she cursed the woods before vanishing. Determined to break the curse and free Eliza's spirit, I returned to the cabin with Mrs. Harlow. We performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and reciting prayers. The air grew thick with tension, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. As we completed the ritual, a blinding light filled the cabin, and the whispers ceased. Eliza's ghostly form appeared, her face serene. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away, leaving the cabin silent and still. The woods returned to their tranquil state, and the sense of dread lifted. I no longer heard the whispers, and the shadows no longer moved on their own. The curse was broken, and Eliza's spirit was finally at peace. Life in the cottage became peaceful once more. I continued to explore the woods, now a place of beauty rather than fear. The cabin remained abandoned, but it no longer held the same menace. It stood as a reminder of the power of the past and the importance of listening to those who seek help, even from beyond the grave. The world as I knew it ended on a cold, gray morning. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the once bustling city now lay silent, its streets abandoned. I was one of the few survivors, clinging to the remnants of a society that had crumbled under the weight of its own hubris. The apocalypse came not with a bang, but with a whisper, a silent descent into madness and chaos. It started with the virus, a plague that spread like wildfire, decimating the population in mere weeks. The government tried to contain it, but it was too late. The infected turned into mindless creatures, driven by an insatiable hunger. We called them the cursed. I had seen them tear through the flesh of the living, their eyes empty, devoid of any humanity. I barricaded myself in my apartment, watching from the window as the world outside descended into anarchy. The screams of the dying echoed through the night, a symphony of despair that haunted my dreams. I scavenged what little food and supplies I could find, rationing them carefully. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The city grew quieter, the cursed thinning out as they starved or moved on in search of new prey. One morning, I decided to leave. The apartment had become a prison, its walls closing in on me. I gathered what supplies I could carry, canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, and a few personal belongings. I armed myself with a kitchen knife and an old baseball bat, the only weapons I had. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, and stepped out into the desolate world. The streets were eerily quiet, the once familiar sounds of the city replaced by an oppressive silence. Cars sat abandoned, their windows shattered, and buildings stood like tombstones, their facades scarred by fire and decay. I moved cautiously, every shadow a potential threat. The cursed were fewer now, but they were still out there, lurking in the ruins. As I walked, I thought about my family. My parents had been among the first to succumb to the virus, their deaths swift and merciless. My younger sister, Emily, had vanished during the chaos, and I held on to the faint hope that she might still be alive. It was this hope that drove me forward, a fragile thread that kept me from surrendering to despair. I made my way through the city, heading towards the outskirts where I hoped to find refuge. The journey was fraught with danger, each step a test of my resolve. I scavenged for supplies where I could, raiding abandoned stores and homes. It was during one such raid that I encountered another survivor. His name was Marcus, a former soldier who had taken refuge in a small grocery store. He was gaunt and wary, his eyes hollow from the horrors he had witnessed. We eyed each other cautiously, each of us sizing up the other. "You alone?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. I nodded. "Yeah, just me." He hesitated, then lowered his weapon, a rusty shotgun. "You can take what you need, there's not much left." "Thanks," I replied, relaxing slightly. "What's your plan?" "Head north," he said. "Heard there might be a safe zone near the mountains. It's a long shot, but it's better than staying here." I considered his words. A safe zone sounded like a distant dream, but it was a glimmer of hope. "Mind if I join you?" He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Sure, safety in numbers, right?" We set off together, forging an uneasy alliance. The journey was grueling, each day a battle for survival. We faced the elements, scavenging for food and water, and fought off the occasional curse that crossed our path. Marcus was a skilled fighter, his military training a valuable asset. He taught me how to handle weapons, how to stay hidden, and how to fight when necessary. Despite the hardships, we began to form a bond. We shared stories of our lives before the fall, fragments of our former selves that gave us a sense of humanity in a world that had lost its way. Marcus spoke of his family, a wife and son he had lost to the virus. I told him about Emily, my hope of finding her a constant motivation. Days turned into weeks, and we made slow progress. The landscape changed as we moved north, the city giving way to suburbs and then to open countryside. The air grew cleaner, the sky clearer, but the sense of danger never left us. One night as we camped under the stars, Marcus confided in me. "I've seen a lot of things in my life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but nothing like this. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it, fighting to survive in a world that's gone to hell." I looked at him, understanding his pain. "We have to hold on to something," I said. "Hope, faith, whatever it is, otherwise we're already dead." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. It was a doubt that gnawed at me, too, a fear that our struggle might be in vain. Our journey took a fateful turn when we stumbled upon a small community of survivors. They had fortified an old farmstead, creating a sanctuary amidst the chaos. There were about a dozen of them, men, women, and children, all clinging to the hope of a better future. They welcomed us cautiously, and we integrated into their group, sharing our skills and resources. Life became a routine of sorts, a semblance of normalcy in an abnormal world. We tended to the crops, fortified the defenses, and kept watch for any sign of the cursed. But peace was fleeting. One night, the cursed found us. They came in droves, drawn by the scent of life. The attack was sudden and brutal, our defenses overwhelmed by sheer numbers. We fought desperately, but it was a losing battle. In the chaos, I saw Marcus fall, torn apart by the creatures he had fought so valiantly against. His screams echoed in my ears as I battled my way through the horde, desperate to reach the others. I found Emily among the survivors, her face a mask of terror. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. "We have to get out of here." We fled into the night, the sounds of battle fading behind us. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing in exhaustion in the woods. The farmstead was lost, and with it, our fragile hope. In the aftermath, we were left with nothing but each other. Emily and I forged on, determined to survive. The world was a wasteland, but we clung to the belief that there was still a place for us somewhere. We moved north, driven by the memory of those we had lost and the hope that we might find others like us. The world died on a Thursday. I remember it clearly because the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, an ironic contrast to the chaos that erupted. It started with the blackout, a complete and utter failure of the power grid. At first, we thought it was just a temporary glitch, but as the hours turned into days, panic set in. Without power, everything fell apart. The government scrambled to restore order, but it was too late. Society unraveled like a frayed rope, each strand snapping under the pressure. The initial calm turned to riots, looting, and violence. People fought over dwindling resources, and the streets became battlegrounds. I was a medical student living in a small apartment near the university. When the blackout hit, I stayed indoors, hoping it would pass. But as the days stretched on, it became clear that this was no ordinary crisis. The news, what little we could gather from battery-operated radios, spoke of a cyber attack, a coordinated strike that had crippled the nation's infrastructure. As the reality of our situation sank in, so did the dread. I ventured out only when necessary, scavenging for food and water. The city was a war zone, its once vibrant streets now littered with debris and bodies. I saw things that haunted my dreams, neighbors turning on each other, families torn apart by desperation. It was survival of the fittest, and I had to adapt quickly. One evening, as I returned from a supply run, I heard a commotion outside my building. Peering from my window, I saw a group of people being attacked by what looked like a mob. But as I watched in horror, I realized these weren't ordinary attackers. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and their eyes glowed with an eerie light. They were like something out of a nightmare. The infected, as we later called them, were victims of a bioweapon released during the cyber attack. The virus spread through the air, turning people into monstrous versions of themselves. They were fast, relentless, and utterly devoid of humanity. I barricaded myself in my apartment, reinforcing the door and windows with whatever I could find. For weeks I lived in constant fear, every noise sending my heart racing. The infected roamed the streets hunting for survivors. The city became their domain, and we were the intruders. It was during one of these nights that I met Sarah. She was a neighbor, a quiet woman who lived a few floors below me. She had been out looking for her daughter when the infected cornered her in the hallway. I heard her screams and, against my better judgment, opened my door to help. Together we fought them off, using makeshift weapons and sheer determination. When the last of the infected lay still, we collapsed, exhausted and shaken. Sarah told me her story, how her daughter had gone missing during the chaos and how she had been searching for her ever since. Her hope was a fragile thing, but it kept her going. We decided to team up, pooling our resources and skills. Sarah was a nurse, and her medical knowledge was invaluable. We set up a small safe zone in my apartment, fortifying it against the infected. For a while it felt almost like a haven. But the city was dying. Each day the infected grew bolder and our supplies dwindled. We knew we couldn't stay there forever. We had heard rumors of a safe zone, a place where survivors had gathered to rebuild. It was a long shot, but it was our only hope. We set out one morning carrying only what we could. The journey was perilous, each step fraught with danger. We avoided the main roads, sticking to alleyways and back streets. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, and the infected were everywhere. One night, as we rested in an abandoned building, Sarah confided in me. "Sometimes I wonder if my daughter is still alive," she said, her voice trembling. "But I have to believe she is. It's the only thing that keeps me going." I nodded, understanding her pain. "We have to hold on to hope," I said. "It's all we have left." Our journey took us through the heart of the city, past scenes of unimaginable horror. We saw survivors hanging from makeshift gallows, victims of mob justice. We saw the infected feasting on the dead, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the burning buildings. The world had become a hellscape, and we were its damned souls. We finally reached the outskirts where the city gave way to open fields and forests. The air was cleaner here, the sky clearer. It felt like a different world, one where hope might still exist. We followed a road that led north, driven by the faint promise of safety. As we walked, we encountered other survivors, each with their own stories of loss and survival. Some joined us, while others continued on their own paths. We became a small band of wanderers united by our shared struggle. One evening, we reached a small village, long abandoned but relatively intact. It was here that we decided to make our stand. We fortified the buildings, setting up a perimeter and stockpiling supplies. It wasn't much, but it was something. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to take on a semblance of normalcy. We tended to the gardens, hunted for food, and kept watch for any signs of the infected. Sarah and I grew close, our shared experiences forging a bond that went beyond mere survival. But peace was fleeting. One night, the infected found us. They came in droves, their eyes glowing in the darkness. We fought desperately, but it was a losing battle. Our defenses crumbled and the village was overrun. In the chaos, I saw Sarah fall, her body torn apart by the creatures she had fought so bravely against. Her screams echoed in my ears as I battled my way through the horde, desperate to reach the others. I found a small group of survivors, and together we fled into the night. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing in exhaustion in the woods. The village was lost, and with it our fragile hope. But we were alive, and as long as we drew breath, there was a chance. In the aftermath, we regrouped, determined to continue our search for the safe zone. The world was a wasteland, but we clung to the belief that there was still a place for us somewhere. We moved north, driven by the memory of those we had lost and the hope that we might find others like us. And so we walked on, through the ruins of a world that had once been, towards a future that was uncertain, but still possible. The echoes of the end followed us, but so did the faint whisper of hope. The echoes of isolation. I had always considered myself an adventurous person, someone who thrived on the thrill of the unknown. So when I stumbled upon an old decrepit cabin deep in the heart of the woods, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The idea of spending a few nights away from civilization, surrounded by nature's eerie beauty, was too enticing to pass up. I packed my bag with essentials, a flashlight, a few canned goods, my trusty Swiss Army knife, and set off early one crisp autumn morning. The hike to the cabin was long and arduous, but the scenery was breathtaking. The dense forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked even more dilapidated than I had imagined, with moss-covered walls and broken windows. Yet there was something undeniably alluring about it. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the fading light, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a small bed in the corner. I set my bag down and began to unpack, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. As night fell, the forest outside grew eerily silent. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin and the distant hoot of an owl. I built a small fire in the old stone fireplace and settled down with a book, hoping to distract myself from the oppressive darkness. But my mind kept wandering, imagining shadows moving just beyond the flickering firelight. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that truly chilled me, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, drifting through the still air. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. It came again, slightly louder this time, a disembodied voice murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew more frequent, and their source seemed to draw closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I clutched my knife tightly, knowing it offered little comfort against whatever was lurking in the darkness. Morning came as a relief, bathing the cabin in weak gray light. The whispers had ceased with the dawn, but their echo lingered in my mind. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, hoping to find some rational explanation for the night's events. The forest was thick and impenetrable, a maze of gnarled trees and tangled underbrush. I found nothing out of the ordinary, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. As evening approached, I considered leaving the cabin and returning to the safety of my home, but my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something here, something that wanted to be discovered. I resolved to stay one more night. The second night was worse. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, filling the cabin with an eerie, almost mournful cadence. I could hear distinct words now, my name repeated over and over, mixed with phrases that sounded like pleas for help. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the dim light. I felt a presence in the room, something unseen but undeniably there. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost deafening. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The cabin fell silent once more, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bag with shaking hands, determined to leave at first light. Just before dawn, I decided to take a look around the cabin one last time. In a small, dusty corner, I found a trapdoor hidden beneath a loose floorboard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. I descended slowly, flashlight in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder and more stale the deeper I went. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small underground room. The walls were lined with old yellowed newspaper clippings and photographs. They told the story of a family that had lived in the cabin many years ago, a family that had mysteriously vanished without a trace. As I examined the clippings, a chill ran down my spine. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their desperate pleas. And then I saw them, faint, ghostly figures materializing in the dim light. They were the spirits of the missing family, trapped in this place, reaching out to me for help. I fled the cabin, my mind reeling with fear and disbelief. As I emerged into the dawn light, the whispers faded, but their memory haunted me. I never returned to that cabin, but the echoes of isolation and the spirit's desperate pleas stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the dark corners of the world. It started as a dare. My friends and I were always looking for new thrills, new ways to push the boundaries of fear. When we heard about the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, we couldn't resist the challenge. The stories we'd heard were enough to make anyone's blood run cold. Tales of mistreated patients, cruel experiments, and restless spirits. One crisp October evening, we gathered our gear, flashlights, a few snacks, and a couple of sleeping bags, and set off for the asylum. The building loomed over us, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. Its windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in ivy and graffiti. The air around it felt heavy, as if the very ground was saturated with the pain and suffering of those who had once been confined within. We joked and laughed as we made our way inside, trying to mask our growing unease. But as the heavy front door creaked shut behind us, sealing us in darkness, the laughter died on our lips. The asylum was silent, save for the distant drip of water and the occasional rustle of rats in the walls. We split up, each of us armed with a flashlight, and a sense of bravado that quickly faded as we ventured deeper into the building. The halls were lined with decaying furniture, old medical equipment, and faded photographs of long-forgotten patients. The air was thick with dust, and every step we took stirred up clouds of it, making it hard to breathe. I found myself drawn to a series of rooms on the upper floor, their doors marked with peeling paint and rusted metal plaques. Each room told a story of despair, of torment, of lives lost to madness and neglect. I could almost hear the echoes of their screams, their pleas for mercy that had gone unanswered. As I explored, I found an old journal tucked away in a drawer. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. It detailed the experiences of a patient named Margaret, who had been admitted to the asylum in the early 1900s. Her words painted a picture of unimaginable horror, of cruel doctors, inhumane treatments, and a constant struggle to maintain her sanity. Night fell quickly, and the asylum grew even darker and more foreboding. We gathered in what had once been the common room, sharing our findings and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. That's when we heard it, a faint, distant cry echoing through the empty halls. We exchanged nervous glances, but curiosity got the better of us. We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cry grew louder, more desperate, leading us to a locked door at the end of a long corridor. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to open it. The room beyond was a small, padded cell. In the corner, huddled in the shadows, was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a cruel prank. But as the figure turned to face us, I realized with a jolt of terror that it was not human. Its eyes were hollow, its face twisted in a mask of agony. It reached out towards us, and we fled in panic, the sound of its cries echoing in our ears. The night became a blur of fear and confusion. We could hear footsteps behind us, whispers in the darkness, and the distant sound of doors slamming shut. It felt as if the asylum itself was alive, trying to trap us within its walls. We tried to stick together, but in the chaos, we were separated. I found myself alone in the basement, the air thick with mold and decay. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint sound of music, a haunting, melancholic tune that seemed to seep into my very soul. I followed it, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The music led me to a large metal door. With trembling hands, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond was a makeshift operating theater filled with rusted surgical tools and blood-stained sheets. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding jars filled with preserved organs and other macabre specimens. My stomach churned at the sight, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. In the center of the room stood an old operating table, its leather straps worn and cracked with age. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay. As I approached the table, I could see dark stains on its surface, the remnants of unspeakable acts performed in this place. Suddenly the music stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, echoing off the walls. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, dressed in a tattered white coat, his face obscured by a surgical mask. His eyes were cold and devoid of emotion, and in his hand he held a scalpel. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with fear. The man advanced towards me, his movements deliberate and menacing. I could feel the cold metal of the scalpel against my skin as he reached out to touch me. In a blind panic, I swung my flashlight at him, and he vanished, leaving only the echo of his presence behind. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The asylum seemed to close in around me, its walls pulsing with a malevolent energy. I could hear the whispers again, growing louder and more insistent, filling my mind with their madness. I ran through the darkened halls, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate and anguished than the last. I could see shadowy figures moving in the darkness, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I reached the main hall where my friends had gathered earlier, but they were gone, their belongings scattered across the floor. The heavy front door was still closed, but it felt like it was miles away. I could feel the asylum's grip tightening around me, pulling me deeper into its twisted embrace. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed open the door and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit my face like a slap, jolting me back to reality. I ran through the overgrown yard, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached the safety of the road. I never looked back, but I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, echoing in the back of my mind. My friends were never found, and the asylum was eventually torn down, replaced by a new development. But the memories of that night stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of sanity.